I want to see the ID, and I want to see a birth certificate for the child.
Officer, you are operating outside the law. Look at the card.
The afternoon sun, warm and benevolent, filtered through the broad leaves of the old oak trees lining the streets of the Crestwood district. It was the kind of Tuesday that felt like a gift, a perfect slice of late spring where the air was sweet, with the scent of blossoming jasmine and freshly cut grass. For Dr. David Martin, it was a rare and precious pocket of peace. Pushing the sleek, German-engineered stroller before him, he listened to the gentle cooing of his one-year-old daughter, Lily, who was currently mesmerized by the dance of a yellow butterfly. This was his sanctuary, not the sterile, high-stakes environment of the operating room where he was a master, but this simple, sun-drenched sidewalk, performing the most important job he would ever have, being a father. He had just left the small neighborhood park, a perfect square of green where Lily had stared in wide-eyed wonder at the golden retrievers and giggled at the spray from the fountains. Now, they were on the final stretch home, a magnificent colonial revival house he and his wife had bought and restored, a symbol of a life built on relentless dedication and brilliance. He adjusted the stroller's canopy to shield Lily's eyes from the sun, his movements practiced and gentle. He was humming a quiet tune, a half-remembered lullaby, when a shadow fell over them. A police cruiser had materialized at the curb, its engine a low, predatory rumble that was utterly alien to the tranquil afternoon. It hadn't used its siren, just coasted to a silent, intimidating stop a few feet ahead of him, blocking his path. David paused, his hand tightening instinctively on the stroller's handle. He assumed the officer needed directions or was looking for a specific address. He offered a polite, questioning look. The man who emerged from the car was not looking for directions. Officer Kyle Nolan was in his late 20s, with a tightly wound physique and a jaw that seemed permanently clenched. He moved with a stiff, deliberate gait that was meant to project authority, but instead telegraphed a deep-seated insecurity. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over David, lingered on his expensive athletic wear, traced the high-tech lines of the stroller, and finally settled on Lily, whose happy babbling had trailed off into a confused silence. Nolan didn't smile. He didn't offer a greeting. His hand rested casually on his utility belt, a gesture that was anything but casual. "Afternoon," Nolan said. The word clipped. It wasn't a greeting. It was an opening gambit. "This your kid?" The question hung in the warm air, absurd and offensive. David blinked, processing the implication. He looked down at Lily, his daughter, with her bright eyes and a tuft of curly black hair that mirrored his own. He then looked back at the officer. "Good afternoon, officer," David replied, his voice even and measured, the same calm tone he used to reassure frightened families in hospital waiting rooms. "Yes, this is my daughter, Lily. Is there a problem?" Nolan ignored the question. He took a slow step closer, deliberately invading David's personal space, forcing him to shift back slightly, creating a defensive barrier with the stroller. "We've had some reports," Nolan began, his voice a low, accusatory drawl, "of domestic disturbances. A man matching your description." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The Crestwood district was a bubble of affluence and tranquility. The only disturbances were arguments over property lines and parking etiquette. David had seen the officer's eyes. This wasn't about a report. This was about him. A black man, in a wealthy neighborhood, with a child who was light-skinned. A beautiful blend of his own heritage and his wife's Irish ancestry. In Officer Nolan's worldview, the picture was wrong. It didn't compute. A disturbance? David repeated, keeping his voice devoid of the frustration that was beginning to simmer beneath the surface. Officer, I can assure you, the only sound we've been making is laughter. We were just at the park. He gestured vaguely down the sunlit street. Nolan's eyes narrowed. The calm, intelligent response seemed to irritate him. In his experience, people who were cornered either got angry or got scared. David was neither. He was composed. To Nolan, that composure was arrogance. I'm going to need to see some identification, Nolan stated. It wasn't a request. And some proof that you're this child's legal guardian. The demand was so outrageously beyond the bounds of a lawful stop that for a moment. David was speechless. Proof? Did he expect him to carry a laminated birth certificate in his pocket for a walk in his own neighborhood? This wasn't a traffic stop. There was no violation, no crime, no probable cause. There was only the color of his skin and the officer's prejudice. A deep, weary sigh escaped David's lips. He had faced down the complexities of the human heart, held life and death in his hands. But this was a different kind of sickness, one for which he had no cure. He knew he had to comply, not because the officer was right, but because he was the one with the gun. Of course, officer, David said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. I'm going to reach into my back pocket, very slowly, to get my wallet. Nolan grunted an assent, his hand moving from his belt to rest on the grip of his service weapon. The message was clear. Any sudden moves, any deviation from the script Nolan had already written in his head, would be met with overwhelming force. As David reached for his ID, the beautiful afternoon felt suddenly cold. The sun a distant, indifferent observer to a scene of quiet, simmering injustice. The confrontation had just begun, but Officer Nolan had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. Before this interaction could cost a man his career and a city its reputation, it's essential to understand the two men standing on that sidewalk, separated by a chasm of experience, discipline, and perception. They were products of two vastly different systems. One dedicated to preserving life, the other to controlling it. Doctor. David Martin was 42 years old, a man whose hands were instruments of impossible precision. As the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Metropolitan General, the city's most prestigious hospital, he was more than a doctor. He was a legend in the making. He was the man you wanted when your own heart was failing, the one who could navigate the labyrinth of arteries and valves with a preternatural calm. He had pioneered a minimally invasive valve replacement technique that was now taught in medical schools across the country. Patients were flown in from around the world, their last hopes pinned on the skill of the man who now stood being interrogated on a sidewalk. His path had been a steep climb, the son of a high school teacher and a postal worker. David had grown up in a world far from the manicured lawns of Crestwood. He had been a scholarship kid, the one who had to be twice as smart, twice as focused, to get half the recognition. He had graduated summa cum laude from Johns Hopkins, then finished at the top of his class at Harvard Medical School. He lived by a code of extreme discipline, a relentless pursuit of perfection born from the knowledge that in his line of work, the margin for error was non-existent. A millimeter's deviation could mean the difference between a child seeing her next birthday and a family shattered by grief. His world was one of science, of evidence, of absolute accountability. In his operating room, assumptions were poison. Bias was a death sentence. Every action had to be justified by data and expertise. He lived in Crestwood because he had earned the right to. He drove a Tesla not for the status, but for the engineering. The stroller he was pushing cost more than some used cars because its safety ratings were the best on the market. and nothing was more important than Lily's well-being. He was a man who understood value, both of human life and of the hard work required to protect it. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, he was simply a father, utterly unaware that his mere presence, his very success, was about to be treated as a probable cause. Officer Kyle Nolan, on the other hand, was a man who lived by a different code entirely. At 29, he had been with the police department for 5 years, a tenure marked by a trail of citizen complaints and a reputation for aggression. He had 6 complaints on his record, 3 for excessive force, 2 for verbal abuse, and 1 for an unlawful search. None had resulted in more than a slap on the wrist. His supervisors saw him as a proactive officer, a departmental euphemism for someone who generated arrests and citations. Regardless of the methods, they noted his high activity numbers but chose to ignore the clear pattern of escalation and confrontation. Nolan had grown up in the shadow of a revered police captain father, and he wore his badge like a birthright. He believed respect was not earned through conduct, but demanded through the projection of power. He saw the world in stark, simple terms. There were cops, and there were criminals. His job was to sort one from the other. He patrolled Crestwood not just to prevent crime, but to enforce a certain order, to be a gatekeeper of the neighborhood's pristine image. Anything or anyone that seemed out of place was, in his eyes, a potential threat. He trusted his gut, a gut feeling that was hopelessly corrupted by years of unexamined prejudice. He had been transferred from the downtown precinct after a particularly ugly incident involving a homeless veteran. The move to the quiet, affluent Crestwood district was supposed to be a cool-down assignment, but Nolan didn't cool down. He brought his confrontational style with him. He saw threats where there were none, mistaking confidence for defiance and questions for insubordination. He was a hammer, and to him. Every citizen who didn't immediately show deference was a nail waiting to be struck. He believed his authority was absolute, his judgment infallible. He had never been truly held accountable for his actions, and that had bred a dangerous sense of impunity. He was a man who operated on assumptions. And on this sunlit afternoon, his assumptions were about to collide with a reality he was completely unprepared for. Officer Nolan's cruiser glided down the tree-lined street, the picture of idyllic suburban peace scrolling past his window. It was 3:15 p.m. The streets were quiet. Nannies pushed strollers, landscapers trimmed hedges, and expensive cars sat gleaming in driveways. Nolan's patrol was a slow, methodical scan, his eyes searching not for crime in progress, but for anomalies, for anything that disrupted the carefully curated harmony of Crestwood. He was hunting for something that didn't belong, and then he saw it. A black man in designer athletic gear, pushing a top-of-the-line stroller. It was a simple, domestic scene. But in the distorted lens of Nolan's perception, the image fractured and reassembled itself into something else entirely. The narrative began to write itself in his mind with a sickening, automatic certainty. He cataloged the details, each one filtered through a prism of suspicion. The man, David, was fit and well-dressed. Too well-dressed for a weekday afternoon, Nolan thought, probably unemployed, trying to look the part. The stroller was an Uppa Baby Vista, a brand Nolan recognized from the high-end department stores he sometimes worked off-duty security at. It was expensive. Where did he get the money for that, he wondered. Probably stolen. Then his eyes fell on the child. Lily's skin was fair, her hair a lighter shade of brown with hints of her mother's auburn. She didn't look exactly like the man pushing her. The final, damning piece clicked into place in Nolan's mind. The child doesn't match. To you or me. This was a father and his biracial daughter, a beautiful, living testament to a loving family. But to Officer Nolan, watching from the climate-controlled cabin of his patrol car, this was a potential kidnapping. He saw a scenario, not a family. He imagined a domestic dispute. A father who had snatched his child from a mother who lived in one of these mansions. Why else would a man like that be here? He must be on the run, trying to blend in. The man's calm demeanor, his gentle humming, wasn't paternal affection. In Nolan's interpretation, it was a calculated act, an attempt to appear normal, to deflect suspicion. He didn't run the plates of the Tesla parked in the driveway David was heading towards. A car that would have come back registered to Dr. David and Mrs. Ann Martin at that very address. He didn't check the local dispatch for any reports of a missing child or a domestic incident. He didn't need to. He had his reasonable suspicion, a flimsy fabrication woven from the threads of his own biases. The prejudice wasn't an unfortunate flaw in his policing. It was the primary tool of his trade. He pulled the cruiser over, the aggressive angle of the stop designed to intimidate, to block the path and immediately establish control. As he stepped out, he was already playing out the confrontation. He would be firm, unyielding. He would break through the suspect's calm facade and expose the truth he was so certain lay beneath. He saw David look up, his expression one of mild curiosity, not fear. This lack of immediate panic was, to Nolan, further proof of guilt. An innocent man would be confused, perhaps even frightened. This man's composure felt like a challenge. It was the arrogance of a criminal who thought he was smarter than the police. Nolan walked towards him, his mind closed. His conclusion already reached. He wasn't there to investigate a situation. He was there to confirm a crime he had already invented. The initial question, "Is this your kid?" was not a question at all. It was an accusation, fired like a warning shot. He watched David's face, searching for a flicker of deception, a hint of fear. He saw only a flash of surprise, quickly replaced by a steely, controlled calm. Nolan interpreted this as the suspect gathering himself, preparing his lies. Every word David spoke, every calm and rational explanation, was filtered through this same poisoned mindset. When David mentioned the park, Nolan's mind screamed. The abduction point! When David offered to show his ID, he thought, he's stalling, trying to control the situation. Officer Nolan wasn't seeing a respected surgeon and loving father. He was seeing a stereotype, a caricature born of a worldview that simply couldn't accept the reality of a successful black man living a peaceful life in a neighborhood Nolan believed he was there to protect from people like him. The entire encounter was built on this foundation of sand, and the ground was already beginning to shift beneath his feet. I'm going to reach into my back pocket, very slowly, to get my wallet, David repeated, his voice a study in forced patience. He made the movement with deliberate slowness, a clear and non-threatening gesture designed to de-escalate a situation that had no reason to exist. Officer Nolan watched the movement with the intensity of a predator, his hand still resting on his firearm. He saw not compliance, but a tactical delay. David slid the worn leather wallet from his pocket. It was a simple, elegant billfold, the kind a man carries for decades. All right, officer. My driver's license is right here, David said, holding the wallet open. The address on it is 1422 Oakmont Drive, which is that house right there. He nodded his head toward the stately home just 2 houses down. Nolan's eyes flickered to the house, then back to David, his expression unchanged. The information didn't register as exculpatory evidence. It was just another part of the suspect's story, a lie that he would soon unravel. I'm not interested in your story, Nolan snapped. I want to see the ID, and I want to see a birth certificate for the child. The sheer audacity of the demand was staggering. David took a deep breath, fighting to keep his composure. Lily, sensing the rising tension, began to fuss in her stroller, her small whimper cutting through the quiet afternoon. "Officer," David said, his voice taking on the sharp edge of a surgeon who would not tolerate incompetence. "You are not legally entitled to demand a birth certificate from me on a public sidewalk without cause. You have articulated no reasonable suspicion of a crime. I am walking home with my daughter. This interaction is over." He made a move to close his wallet and turn the stroller toward his home. It was the breaking point. To Nolan, this was not a citizen asserting his rights. This was a criminal challenging his authority. It was defiance. It was the final confirmation of his guilt. He felt the eyes of a woman watering her petunias across the street. The gaze of a mailman paused at the end of the block. He was being watched. He couldn't lose control. He had to win. "You're not going anywhere," Nolan barked, stepping directly in front of the stroller, his body language screaming aggression. "You think you can talk to me like that? You think you're above the law?" "The law is precisely what I am talking about, officer," David retorted, his patience finally gone, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. "You are operating outside of it. You are engaging in harassment based on a profile you've created in your head. Now, either you articulate a crime I am suspected of committing, or you will step aside." The use of legal terminology, harassment, profile, articulate a crime, was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Nolan hated jailhouse lawyers, people who used big words to try and trip him up. He felt his authority slipping away, being dismantled piece by this man's infuriating calm and intelligence. He needed to reassert dominance, and he only knew one way to do it. "You're obstructing my investigation," Nolan yelled, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "That's a crime right there." "An investigation into what?" David demanded. "The crime of walking while black? The crime of a father taking his daughter to the park? You have nothing, officer, and you know it." "I've got all I need," Nolan seethed. His face was flushed, a vein throbbing at his temple. He was no longer a peace officer. He was a bully in a schoolyard who had just been outsmarted. The script he had written for this encounter had been thrown out, and he was improvising, poorly and dangerously. He looked from David's unflinching eyes down to the whimpering child in the stroller. He saw the expensive device, the well-dressed man, the house in the distance, and in that moment of pure, unadulterated prejudice, he made a decision that would not only destroy his career, but would send shockwaves through the entire city. He was done talking. He was going to take control, and he was going to make this arrogant man pay for his insolence. The quiet suburban street was about to become a crime scene, but the perpetrator was the one wearing the badge. The air crackled with a tension so thick it was almost visible. Lily's whimpers had turned into full-blown. Frightened sobs, the universal sound of a child sensing danger. David's focus was split between the officer in front of him and his terrified daughter. He instinctively reached down to soothe her, his hand resting on her small back. "Don't move!" Nolan shouted, misinterpreting the paternal gesture as something sinister, a reach for a hidden weapon or an attempt to flee. "Hands where I can see them, now!" "I am comforting my crying child, whom you are terrifying," David said through clenched teeth, his voice a low growl of protective fury. He slowly raised his hands to shoulder height, palms open. "This has gone far enough." "It's gone far enough when I say it has." Nolan snarled. He lunged forward. The movement was shockingly fast. Nolan shoved the expensive stroller aside with one hand. It careened off balance, one wheel lifting off the pavement before crashing back down, the impact jarring Lily. whose cries escalated into a panicked scream. With his other hand, Nolan grabbed David by the front of his shirt, the high-tech fabric stretching and tearing. "I told you not to move!" David, a man whose entire profession was built on control and precision, was caught completely off guard by the raw, undisciplined violence. He stumbled backward, his balance lost. Nolan used the momentum, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the rough bark of an ancient oak tree that stood sentinel on the lawn. The impact drove the air from David's lungs in a pained gasp. His cheek scraped against the bark, a sharp, searing pain. "You're under arrest!" Nolan yelled, the words a triumphant declaration for the small audience that was now gathering. The woman with the petunias had her phone out, its camera lens a small, unblinking eye. The mailman was on his radio, his face a mask of disbelief. "For what?" David managed to choke out, his mind reeling. "Assaulting a tree? You assaulted me!" He felt Nolan wrenching his arms behind his back, twisting his shoulder at a painful angle. "Resisting arrest, obstruction, disorderly conduct." Nolan rattled off the holy trinity of catch-all charges, the go-to script for justifying an unjustifiable use of force. He was pulling out his handcuffs, the metallic click echoing in the suddenly silent street as he snapped the first cuff around David's wrist. He made it tight, deliberately tight. He wanted to inflict pain, to punish the man for his perceived arrogance. "Hey, he wasn't doing anything!" a voice shouted from across the street. It was the mailman. "I saw the whole thing!" "You had no reason to touch him!" "Get back!" Nolan screamed over his shoulder, his face contorted with rage. "This is official police business! Disperse or you'll be next!" David fought the primal urge to struggle, to fight back against the injustice. But his disciplined mind took over. He knew the law. He knew that any physical resistance now, no matter how justified, would be used against him. It would be twisted into the narrative Nolan was creating. The violent, non-compliant suspect who had to be subdued. He had to be smarter. He had to let the system hang itself. His face pressed against the rough bark, the scent of earth and sap filling his nostrils. David's mind shifted. He was no longer just a father. He was a diagnostician, and this was a pathology. He began gathering evidence. He noted the time from the mailman's watch. He noted the officer's name tag, K. Nolan. He noted the growing number of witnesses with their cell phones recording every second of his humiliation. He noted the feeling of the cold steel biting into his wrists and the sound of his daughter's terrified screams from the stroller a few feet away. Each detail was a piece of data, a part of the overwhelming case he was building, not for a courtroom, but for the reckoning that was surely to come. The line had been crossed, and for Officer Kyle Nolan, there was no going back. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, officer," David said, his voice muffled against the tree bark, but clear and unwavering. "I am asking you, for your own sake, to stop what you are doing. Check my identification. It's in my wallet, on the ground." "I'll check it at the station, perp." Nolan grunted, panting slightly from the exertion. He finished securing the second handcuff and yanked David upright. The humiliation was absolute. A pillar of the community, a man who held lives in his hands daily, was being treated like a common criminal in front of his own home, in front of his crying child. Nolan shoved David toward his patrol car. Lily's screams were tearing at David's heart. "My daughter," David said, his voice cracking for the first time. "You can't just leave her." "We'll call social services from the station," Nolan said dismissively, as if the child were a piece of lost property. The callousness of the statement was breathtaking. It was then that a second police car, a supervisor's SUV, pulled up, its lights flashing. A stocky, older sergeant with salt and pepper hair and a weary face stepped out. It was Sergeant Frank Miller, a 30-year veteran who had seen everything the city had to offer. The mailman had called it in. "Nolan, what the hell is going on here?" Miller demanded, his eyes taking in the scene. The handcuffed man, the crying baby, the circle of witnesses with their phones held high. "Sarge, I got a situation here," Nolan said, his chest puffed out, still high on adrenaline. This guy was acting suspicious with the kid. Refused to identify, became belligerent. "I think it might be a parental kidnapping." Sergeant Miller's gaze shifted to David. He didn't see a kidnapper. He saw a well-dressed man in a state of controlled fury, his face scraped, his wrists cuffed. He saw the expensive stroller and the terrified baby. Something felt profoundly wrong. "What was your probable cause for the stop, Nolan?" Miller asked, his voice dangerously low. He didn't look right for the neighborhood." "Sarge," Nolan stammered, the flimsy justification sounding pathetic even to his own ears now that he had to say it out loud to a superior. Miller's face hardened. He looked at David. "Sir, what is your name?" "My name is David Martin," David said. "My wallet is on the ground next to the tree. I live 2 doors down. All this officer had to do was look at it. He refused." Miller walked over, picked up the wallet, and opened it. He pulled out the driver's license. "David Martin, 1422 Oakmont Drive." He looked up at the house number, then back at the license. He sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "Nolan, you idiot," he muttered under his breath. Then, his eyes caught something else in the wallet, tucked behind the driver's license. It was another piece of identification, a laminated card with a prominent logo. He slid it out. His eyes widened. The blood drained from his face. He stood frozen for a solid 5 seconds. The card held between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a holy relic. He looked from the ID card to the man in handcuffs, his expression a mixture of horror and awe. "Oh, my God," Miller whispered. Nolan, sensing the dramatic shift in the atmosphere, grew nervous. "What is it, Sarge?" Miller turned slowly, his face ashen. He held up the ID card for Nolan to see. The text was clear, even from a few feet away. "Metropolitan General Hospital, David Martin, M.D., Ph.D., Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery." The title hung in the air, a pronouncement of doom. Nolan stared at the card. Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. The name of the hospital. The city's beacon of hope. The title. A signifier of a status so far beyond his comprehension, it felt like a physical blow. The man he had slammed against a tree, the perp he had just accused of kidnapping, was not just a resident. He was royalty in the one world that every single person, including cops, eventually had to reckon with, the world of medicine. Nolan's brain struggled to process the information. The arrogant defiance wasn't arrogance. It was authority. The expensive clothes weren't a costume. They were the casual attire of a man who earned more in a month than Nolan did in a year. The entire narrative he had so carefully constructed disintegrated into dust. "Sarge, I thought," he stammered, his bravado vanishing, replaced by the panicked, squeaking voice of a boy who had just broken his father's most prized possession. "Shut your mouth, Nolan," Miller roared, the sound echoing down the quiet street. He fumbled for his cuff key. "Just shut your damn mouth." He rushed over to David, his hands trembling as he unlocked the handcuffs. "Dr. Martin," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. "Sir, I am so sorry." The handcuffs fell away. David rubbed his raw, indented wrists, his dark eyes fixed on Kyle Nolan. The young officer stood paralyzed, his face a sickly shade of pale green. The cocky warrior cop was gone. In his place was a child who had just realized he'd picked a fight with a god. The silence that fell over the street was heavier than any shout had been. The only sounds were Lily's exhausted sobs, slowly subsiding as her father, now free, leaned into the stroller and murmured to her in a low, soothing voice. The small crowd of onlookers stood motionless, bearing witness to the spectacular implosion of an officer's career. They had just seen the balance of power shift so violently, it was like watching a law of physics being broken. Sergeant Miller stood stiffly, his face a mask of professional dread. He knew what this was. This wasn't an incident that could be smoothed over with a quick apology and a supervisor's report. This was a city-level crisis blooming in real time on a residential street, recorded on at least a half-dozen smartphones. "Doctor, Martin," Miller began again, his voice strained. "Are you injured? Do you need me to call for a medic?" David turned his gaze from his daughter to the sergeant, then let it slide past him to settle on Officer Nolan, who seemed to shrink under the weight of it. "A medic won't be necessary, Sergeant," David said, his voice cold and precise, like a scalpel. "What I require is your name and badge number. And his—" He nodded toward Nolan. "I will be filing a formal complaint. I will be speaking with the chief of police, and I will be contacting my attorney. This will not be swept under the rug." "Of course, Doctor." "Absolutely," Miller said, quickly providing his information. He then turned to Nolan, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Nolan! Give the doctor your name and badge number. Now!" Nolan flinched as if he'd been struck. "Officer Kyle Nolan," he mumbled, his eyes glued to the pavement. "Badge number 724. "Look at him when you speak to him," Miller barked. Nolan forced his head up, his eyes meeting David's for a fleeting, terrifying moment. In David's gaze, he saw no hatred, no anger. He saw something far worse, a calm, analytical assessment. It was the look of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal disease. "Officer Nolan," David said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you left my daughter's stroller on the curb when you assaulted me. Please put it back on the sidewalk." The request was so simple, so mundane, yet it was a devastating exercise in power. It was an order, and Nolan had no choice but to obey. Wordlessly, his hands shaking, Nolan walked over to the stroller, his movements clumsy and uncertain. He righted the expensive piece of equipment, his face burning with a humiliation so profound it was painful to watch. He had gone from enforcer to errand boy in the span of 5 minutes. "Nolan," Sergeant Miller said, his voice like ice, "give me your sidearm." "Sarge?" Nolan whispered, horrified. "Your service weapon. Unload it and hand it to me. Now!" It was the ultimate disgrace for a police officer, to be disarmed in the field. It was a clear signal that he was no longer trusted, that he was now a liability. With fumbling fingers, Nolan ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and handed the heavy pistol to his sergeant. But first, "Now your badge." He unpinned the silver shield from his chest, the symbol of the authority he had so grotesquely abused, and handed it over. It felt like he was handing over his entire identity. "My patrol car is right there," Miller said, pointing. "Get in the passenger seat. Do not touch the radio. Do not speak to anyone. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. You are on administrative suspension pending a full investigation. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Sarge," Nolan whispered. He turned and did the walk of shame, past the silent neighbors, past the mailman, past the life he had just annihilated. He got into the SUV and stared blankly through the windshield, a ghost in his own life. Sergeant Miller turned back to David. "Doctor, on behalf of the department, I cannot express how sorry I am. This is not what we stand for. Sergeant, David interrupted, his tone leaving no room for excuses. Today, this is exactly what your department stood for. Your officer, armed with a badge and a gun, decided that my existence in my own neighborhood was a crime. The only thing that stopped him from putting me in the back of that car and charging me with felonies I did not commit was a piece of plastic in my wallet. Not the law, not his training, not common decency, a job title. He paused, letting the words sink in. Think about that. Miller had no answer. He simply nodded, the weight of the coming storm settling on his shoulders. The phones were still recording. The story was already spreading. The fallout had just begun. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Crestwood, the video was already a virus. It had been uploaded to social media with a simple, devastating title: Crestwood cop assaults father, tries to arrest surgeon for walking with his own child. The footage, shaky but clear, was damning. It showed David's calm demeanor, Nolan's escalating aggression, the shove, the slam against the tree, and Lily's heartbreaking cries. By nightfall, it had 1 million views. By the next morning, it was the lead story on every national news network. The city was thrown into a firestorm. The fact that the victim was not just an innocent man, but Dr. David Martin, the city's beloved miracle worker surgeon, turned the incident from a local outrage into a national scandal. The hospital issued a statement expressing its unwavering support for Dr. Martin and its profound dismay at the unconscionable treatment of one of its most vital community members. The mayor, the city council, the police chief, they all scrambled to get in front of the tidal wave of public fury. Officer Kyle Nolan was fired less than 72 hours later. The internal investigation was a mere formality. The bystander videos, the mailman's testimony, and Sergeant Miller's scathing report painted an irrefutable picture of gross misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of power. Nolan became a pariah, a symbol of the worst kind of policing. Dr. Martin sued the city. He didn't need the money, but he knew that a lawsuit was the only language the city's bureaucracy truly understood. It was a tool, like a scalpel, to excise a cancer. He won a settlement of $6.2 million, one of the largest in the city's history. But the victory was not in the dollar amount. The real victory was in the terms of the settlement, which he dictated personally with his legal team. The settlement mandated the establishment of the Nolan Act, a sweeping set of police reforms. It required mandatory ongoing implicit bias training for every officer. It established a new, independent civilian oversight board with the power to investigate and discipline officers. Most importantly, it ended qualified immunity for any officer found to have violated a citizen's civil rights during a non-criminal encounter. It was a revolution in local law enforcement, forced into existence by one man's dignity and another's prejudice. 2 years later, David stood on his back porch, watching Lily, now a bubbly 3-year-old, chase fireflies in the twilight. The money from the settlement had been used to create the Martin Foundation, a nonprofit that provided scholarships for promising minority students who wanted to enter the medical field. His life had returned to a semblance of normal, but the scar from that afternoon remained. He thought about Kyle Nolan sometimes, not with hate, but with a kind of clinical pity. He saw him as a product of a flawed system. A young man fed a steady diet of fear and suspicion, taught that control was more important than communication. But pity did not absolve him of responsibility. The system may have loaded the gun, but Nolan had been the one to pull the trigger. Mostly, though. He thought about the men and women who weren't chiefs of surgery, the ones who didn't have a get-out-of-jail-free card tucked in their wallets. The landscapers, the janitors, the teachers, the everyday citizens who found themselves in that same impossible situation, slammed against a car or a tree, and had no powerful title to save them. The ones whose arrests were processed, whose lives were ruined, whose stories were never told on the national news, who spoke for them. Justice, he had learned in the most visceral way imaginable, should never depend on a name badge. It should be a right, as fundamental as the air we breathe. But on that sunny afternoon, he had been reminded just how easily that right could be taken away, and how for so many, it was never truly there at all. The story of Dr. Martin and Officer Nolan is a tragedy of perception at its core. Officer Nolan's actions stemmed from a psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias. He did not patrol Crestwood to observe reality. He patrolled to find evidence that confirmed his pre-existing worldview, a world where a black man in an affluent area is an anomaly and therefore a threat. If David had been a nervous, poorly dressed man, Nolan's bias would have been confirmed. If David had been angry and loud, his bias would have been confirmed. The fact that David was calm, articulate, and well-dressed was so dissonant with Nolan's prejudice that his brain couldn't process it as innocence. It had to reinterpret it as the cunning of a sophisticated criminal. His insecurity in the face of David's quiet authority was the fuel. He felt intellectually and socially inferior, and his badge and gun were the only tools he had to reclaim a sense of dominance. What could have been done differently? If we could rewind the tape, David might have immediately stated his name and address before being asked, perhaps even mentioning he was a doctor at Metropolitan General. "Good afternoon. Officer, I'm Dr. David Martin. I live right there at 1422. Just taking my daughter home from the park. Is there anything I can help you with?" By immediately establishing his identity and connection to the neighborhood, he might have short-circuited Nolan's prejudiced narrative before it could fully form. It is a sad truth that for some, the burden of de-escalation falls upon the innocent. Protecting oneself in these situations often means swallowing immense pride and playing a strategic game, providing information that shouldn't be necessary, all to manage the fragile ego of the person with the power. The ultimate lesson here is stark and deeply unsettling. Accountability is often the child of status. Officer Nolan's career ended not simply because he was wrong, but because he was wrong about someone powerful. True justice will only be achieved when an assault on the dignity of a janitor is met with the same swift and decisive consequences as an assault on the dignity of a surgeon. Until then, we are merely policing the powerful and powerful policing the rest. This story is a call to recognize that the fabric of justice is not woven from grand courtroom declarations, but from the simple, everyday interactions on sidewalks and streets. It is measured by how we treat the stranger, the person whose story we do not know. What do you think? Is it fair that a person's best defense against injustice might be their job title? How can we build a system of policing where respect is the default, not a privilege granted only after an ID is checked? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe that justice should be blind to the contents of a person's wallet and that a badge should be a symbol of responsibility, not a license for prejudice, share this story. Let's demand a better script.